Hi everyone, this is a Barclay Damon live broadcast where we discuss all things L&E, labor, and employment. I'm Ari, let's dig in. Hey everyone, welcome back to What to Do When the DOL is Knocking at Your Door, Part 3, New York State Department of Labor Audits. This is our third episode in a series of episodes where we tell you basically the ins and outs of what as an employer you need to know about Department of Labor audits, both at the federal and state level. So today I am thrilled to announce that Rosemary Enright is back with us. If you listen to the podcast, you probably know Rosemary is the practice group leader for the firm's labor and employment practice group, which means that she heads off of the group of attorneys that we have at the firm that practice labor and employment across the state and in Massachusetts and Connecticut as well. So Rosemary, with that introduction, welcome back.
It's good to be back, Ari. I'm glad I made the cut.
Yes, we're glad to have you, or I'm glad to have you, I should say. But, you know the drill, Rose, since you're kind of a repeat guest on the podcast, that the first thing I ask our guests after I give my introduction is for them to share a fun or interesting fact about themselves. And I think we have a bit of a theme going with you, and you always share a really good, interesting travel story. So to our listeners, I know that Rosemary is basically like a jet setter, and she's always traveling here, there, and everywhere, maybe not in the pandemic, but she has great travel stories. So Rosemary, hit us with an interesting Rosemary travel story.
All right, all my other travel stories were outside the country. So we're going to stay in the country this time.
Very pandemic forward.
Right. That's right. That's exactly right. So several years ago, I don't even know how many years ago it was, I don't know, maybe 10 or something like that. I was out with friends and we were talking and they were reminiscing about a cross-country road trip they had done. And I said, I have never driven cross country. And they were shocked. They said, how could you have never done that? Like, I'm going to do it. And so we literally spent 9 weeks. We started in Washington, D.C., because I was living there at the time, and we did the southern route. And we drove all through the South, and we ultimately stopped in San Francisco, which I'd been to a million times. I think most people know I was with Oracle for 16 years. So I was, I had an office out there. But we did the whole southern route, 9 weeks. Almost 10,000 miles, Ari. And if anyone were to look at our journey, it was like this. So it wasn't we're going across. It was, we're, oh my gosh, we forgot there's a pie place. We want to go here. And so it was a whole mix of kitsch. So we saw the biggest ball of twine. We saw the golden peanut down in Georgia. Okay. The Jolly Green Giant. I mean, we did all of that. But we also did, kind of educational and historical stuff. So we went to the Civil Rights Museum down in Memphis and the Rock and Soul Museum in Memphis. And so lots of cool. So it was a whole mix of things. But it was a lot of fun. And I would highly recommend it. And if anybody's looking for tips on kitsch or Americana, give me a ring.
Yeah. Well, actually, it's funny, Rosemary, because for once I can actually say that I have a similar travel experience, which
there you go.
I don't think you and I ever talked about. But before I started my, career as an attorney, in that sweet spot period of time where you take the bar exam and then you have like a month before you have to start working. Yeah. My husband and I did the same, and we drove from Buffalo to San Diego, the north way there, and on the way back we did like more of the southern route, but we did it in like 2.5 weeks because we didn't have 9 weeks, unfortunately. But I have to say, not that this is a travel podcast, if you're listening and you have never driven across country or even gone out west or seen any of the national parks, because that was like a big focus of what we saw on our road trip, like 10 out of 10 would recommend, have to do it. I like going abroad just as much as anybody else, but there really are some amazing things to see here.
I agree. I couldn't agree more, Ari. Seriously. Yeah. I mean, there are just some amazing, amazing places. And, people diss, if we've got anybody from North Dakota listening, all right. And
I love North Dakota when I went there.
I did too. And people diss North Dakota and South Dakota. They're awesome. We ended up spending, we were supposed to be there like 2 days and we spent a week because
Yes.
it's beautiful.
And we
So
were kind of the same. Like we booked hotels as we went. We kind of, we saw like a sign, Badlands National Park. We're like, let's go. It was awesome. So
yeah.
anyway, maybe we can have a side travel related podcast, but
Yeah.
let's give the people, what they want to hear and jump into the New York State Department of Labor audit topic. So Rosemary, to our listeners, if you listened to the first couple episodes of this segment, Ben Wilkinson and I really went through the nitty gritty, as we like to say. One of the first things I asked Ben, Rosemary, was, what is the U.S. Department of Labor and what laws do they enforce? So I want to kind of pivot and just point that question in your direction for New York State. Just briefly, what is the New York State DOL and what laws do they enforce?
Okay, so the New York State Department of Labor, now there's multiple divisions within it. And so let's just focus on one, and that'll be labor standards. Okay, so let's just talk for purposes of this podcast. So labor standards enforces, as the name implies, New York labor laws. So what do we mean by labor laws? Well, you and I know, Ari, but for our listeners, just in case, your meal periods, right? So, they enforce the meal period requirements, uniform maintenance, travel time, overtime, so, and another way to think of it is basically anything that has to do with the various wage orders. Now, if somebody's sitting out there and they're thinking, I don't know what a wage order is, give us a call because you've got, seriously.
Right. You need to know. Yes.
That's the truth, though, isn't it, Ari? I mean, New York State has a miscellaneous wage order, and it talks about all of the relevant labor laws that you're responsible for complying with, and there's one for hospitality in that. So basically, anything to do with those wage orders, anything to do with the New York labor laws. Okay, right. And labor standards, they enforce, I'm sure Ben told you, there's a certain cutoff, certain types of companies, size in that they investigate or they audit or work with. In New York State, it's any employer in New York State.
Yeah, and I think that's a very important distinction because those requirements or those things that you have to satisfy or an investigator at the federal level is looking to see that you qualify for really don't apply under state audits. So if you have employees, you could be subject to an audit in New York.
Yep, that's right. I mean, you could have, you have one or two employees, you're subject. Doesn't matter. So a lot think, well, I'm just this small little mom and pop, restaurant or dry cleaner or something like that. No, you could be subject to an investigation or audit by the New York State Department of Labor.
That's a really good point. So just high level, Ro, one of the things I wanted to ask you just for our listeners, the benefit of our listeners are, just generally what is an audit and are there different types of audits or different types of things that the Department of Labor is looking at when they're performing an audit?
I don't know if I'd say there's different types of audits per se. There's always an investigator. And they're going to come out and look at your records, but they're looking at different types of things. So depending on why they're there, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But depending on why they're there is going to determine the types of records they're going to ask for, whether or not they're going to interview employees, whether or not they're going to come on site, or just do it all electronically. So, but basically, an audit is an audit is an audit. Right?
I like that.
In New York State, you know.
So, Rosemary, that's a great point. I wanted to ask you, because I think if you're an employer in New York and you're listening, or you own a business in New York and you have employees you're listening, how do I become subject to an audit? So if you're an employer, how do you become subject to an audit? How are you notified? What are the types of issues that come up?
Right. So you become the subject in one of two ways. The first is somebody complains. Right, so it may be one of your employees, right? So they may go to the Department of Labor, and for those of you, if you just go out and put in the New York State Department of Labor, you'll see there's a place where you can just file a complaint. All right, that happened a lot with COVID, but they can just go out and file that complaint, or they can pick up the phone and call. So it can be an employee voicing a concern or complaint. We've had a couple instances where it was not an employee, but it was someone who happened to be in a place of business, observed something, and made a complaint. So it's a complaint, or it's, you unfortunately, unlike the lottery, like when you're like, yay, my number came up. In this
Right.
case, they do random audits, right?
Yeah.
So they do random audits. And, a great example of that is in the healthcare space, specifically those with home care health agencies.
Mhm.
Right now, those are, I don't want to use the word target because that makes it sound really negative, but they're the subject of quite a few audits right now, and it's not based on complaints. There was an initial complaint for one particular home health care agency. They went in, started to look at the records and thought, we should start looking at some of these others, and now many of them have been subject to audits. So it's kind of that random, it comes up, as I said, either your number, because we all know, the Department of Labor, everybody's registered in the state of New York.
Yes.
But it could also be because they've got an area of focus.
Right.
And
Yeah. And Ben talked a little bit about that too, Rosemary. But that's a great point, Ro. And Ben talked a lot about that with respect to the horse trading industry, because I think on the federal side of things, audits were, as you said, I don't want to say targeted toward that industry, but that the reality was it was happening a lot in that particular industry. So Rosemary, one of the things I wanted to ask you, and I asked Ben this on the federal side, but when New York State is performing an audit, or the DOL is performing an audit in New York, if you're an employer, how do you become aware that you're the subject of an audit?
So it's stressful no matter how you find out, but I do have to say there is a less. I personally think when you get the letter in the mail, that's far less stressful. So typically you'll receive something in the mail, but I have had two of my clients, two of my employers, where literally the Department of Labor, the investigator walked in with his ID and a badge saying, I'm with the New York State Department of Labor. We've got a complaint. I'm here to interview your employees. So, and that is like when your blood pressure goes through the roof, Ari. So, but typically it's a letter. You get a letter in the mail that you're the subject of an investigation, and they'll, contact us, and then you're off to the races. Yeah.
So thanks, Rosemary. That's helpful. It seems like this whole notion that an investigator just shows up at your door is a little bit more common, under the federal side of things, or when the U.S. DOL is performing an audit, but it can still happen in New York. So I think it's important for us to point out. So just high level, Ro, can you talk about what happens during the audit, and what is the audit process basically when an audit is being conducted by the New York State Department of Labor?
Sure. And I think the first question, as Ari and I know, that always comes up is, so did somebody complain? Why are you here? They're not going to tell you. Right? They don't tell you. Now, often, as you get into the audit, you're able to kind of glean, oh, this was clearly a complaint that came in. But but that's the first thing that comes to mind. You have to fight that urge. Well, what happened? Who complained? What did they say?
Right.
It's not helpful. It's not helpful.
That was counsel that Ben gave last week as well, because I think it is a hard pill to swallow when you have somebody, showing up or sending you a letter and saying, I need all this information, and you really aren't probably going to find out why.
Yeah, it's very, and everybody, and then what happens is I've had a lot of employers say, you know what, I think it's Ari. I've noticed Ari. She's been acting funny, and and then all of a sudden, and that's
a whole other issue. Yeah, a whole other can of worms, right?
That's right. And then it's like, don't leave Ari alone. All right, just leave Ari alone. We don't want to get hit with a retaliation claim now. In addition,
it wasn't Ari. No, I'm just
That's right. It wasn't Ari. Yeah. But anyway, so you get this letter in the mail. So let's go with the more common way this happens. All right. So you get a letter in the mail, and the other thing, the first thing you think is, because they're going to ask you for a laundry list, right? So it's probably going to be, your employment records for the past 3 years, and your payroll records, and this and that. And the question is, can they ask for that? Absolutely. All right. They can ask for that, and you are required to produce it. Now, so it'll come in, this letter will come in, and they'll have a whole host of documents that they're asking you for. And there will typically be a deadline, and it will be an unreasonable deadline because, they go back 3 years.
Yes.
That's the other question. How long can they go back? Rosemary, they're asking me for 2 years. That seems ridiculous. Agreed.
The answer is it's not, though. I mean, well, it may be ridiculous. It might be, but they're within their rights to ask for it.
That's exactly right. And in fact, if you go and you read the labor law,
Yep.
it says they can actually go back. Everybody breathe, deeply. 6 years.
Right.
All right. They
It's
don't.
substantial.
Yeah, which is a lot. Yeah. So they don't typically do that. They
Okay.
typically go back 3 years. And what will happen is, if they're going through the records, if it looks like maybe they were the subject of an audit or an investigation in the past for a similar type situation, all right, or complaint. If it was a complaint, they're going to go back 6 years because they're going to think this was done intentionally.
Right.
All right. And so, but typically it's just 3 years. You've got the document request, and you've got to comply. And as we said, often it is going to be an unreasonable time frame. Right? And what I will say to you is the key with all of this is compliance and you treating them with respect. Not that any of our listeners would be disrespectful,
Right.
but it is scary and it is frustrating. And you may call, and the Department of Labor, each of those investigators is handling, 50, 60, 70 of these.
Yes.
And they have deadlines and they've got all these documents that are coming in. And if you're calling and you're being difficult or you're refusing to turn something over or you're only giving part of it, that is not going to endear you to them. So compliance, respect, and they will 9 times out of 10 give you an extension. I have never had an investigator say to me, no, we're not going to give you a month to do this or 2 months. Because again, things happen. People are on vacation. It might be during the holidays. So you work with them. But at the end of the day, whatever they're asking for, you have to turn over. Now, and what I'd say is, and Ben may have said this, as you're going through and you're collecting all of this data, you're looking at your documents. You should be looking at them because that, for example, if there's a question like this, show us your records that show confirming or indicating the meal periods or the times, the breaks that your people get. All right, ding, 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 that's a flag. This is probably a complaint and somebody said you're not properly paying them.
Exactly.
Yeah. And so look through those documents and pause and think, are we doing this right? And if you realize that, whoops, we were making a mistake, all right, you immediately get into compliance. And everybody says, well, doesn't that make us look like we're guilty? And it's, well,
Right.
You made a mistake. And so that is going to help you with the Department of Labor. They're
Right.
going to look favorably on you saying, you know what, we didn't know. It was
We
an
didn't
honest.
know, and then when we found out, we took prompt action to correct it instead of just kind of letting it fester.
Right. Or waiting for you to come back and
Right.
say to us, this is wrong.
Right.
And the other thing is, quite frankly, Ari, it cuts off your damages, right? So,
Yes.
so when I say damages, what you may owe your employees.
Yes.
And so because some of these audits, I had one that went on for 18 months, and so that's just, dollars and dollars just racking up.
Exactly.
So
Exactly.
you want to try to stop that. So basically you get the letter in the mail, you pick up the phone, you acknowledge that you've got it, you ask for the extension of time, and then you start putting the documents together and you comply. All right. And so you submit what you have to submit and and you see where that goes. Now, there's more we could talk about. As most of you know, Ari and I could go on for hours about this
For
stuff.
days, yes.
Yeah, that's right. It's true. It's true.
It's
But I mean,
true.
but I'll stop. I'll stop there because let's say you've put everything in, and actually, I'm going to talk a little bit more, Ari, and feel free to
Yeah.
cut me off or chime in. But so let's say you put all the documents in. Then you get from the what you get from the Department of Labor, similar to the heart attack when they come in with the badge. Now you get the letter, and it's like when you applied to colleges: thin, not good; thick. So in this case, it's the opposite: thick, not good.
Thin. Great.
That's right. Thin is you're in compliance.
Right.
But yeah, you get that thick envelope, look out. And the reason it's thick is because they're going to include in there what they refer to as a recapitulation, document. And it's going to list every single employee on there and what they are allegedly owed.
Right.
All right. So the Department of Labor is going to do an audit, and they're going to come up with it, and you're going to die because it's going to be some insane number.
Amount. Right.
Yeah, exactly.
And that's actually perfect, Rosemary, because one of the last things I wanted to ask you about, was settlement. So you're the subject of an audit, you've put together your documents, you've submitted what you need to submit, you complied with the deadline, you probably had an attorney helping you. Is there opportunity for settlement, or in your experience, are investigators or is the department looking to really work it out?
It's a great question. And my answer is it depends on what you mean by settlement. Right? So everybody asks, okay, well, now I see this number, $210,000, real number, people. That's actually a real number that one of my clients got hit with. And they're like, well, can we negotiate with them? Because there's always room to negotiate. And the answer is kind of. All right. So remember what we said at the beginning. The Department of Labor is enforcing all of the labor laws. All right. And it has to do typically with wages, meal periods, uniform maintenance, all of those types of things. It's all money. It's all wages.
Yeah.
The Department of Labor cannot negotiate away an individual's earned wages, right? They're not going to do that. This isn't, I'm going to write you a check and you're going to sign a release. These are wages allegedly owed. And so they're going to make you pay them. All right. So, but when you get that recapitulation, and assuming you're working with counsel, what your counsel will do is go through and say, all right, let's point out all the mistakes. All right, all the reasons that this one's wrong and that one's wrong, or why their interpretation of the records, what they think they saw, what they think they read is wrong. And so I'll tell you that $210,000 number I told you, we got that down to under $100,000. Because again, if you're thinking kind of settlement, Ari, we went back and said, wait a second, you don't understand how our business works. And so we as counsel spent a lot of time communicating with the Department of Labor investigator and his in this particular instance, it was a gentleman, his supervisor, drafted a lot of letters laying everything out, citing the different laws and that, and got it, the number brought down. So if by settlement we mean, is there room for you to say, hey, wait a second, you're wrong, and look at this and that? Absolutely. And you know what? You're crazy if you don't.
Right.
I mean, you should you're crazy if you don't push back and say, wait a second, this isn't right. And here's why it's not right. So just because the Department of Labor gives you that recapitulation doesn't mean that you have to agree to it.
Yes. All great points, Ro. I think this has been a great high level view of New York State Department of Labor audits. Before we close for today, Ro, is there anything else that you want to share, or any pieces of advice we maybe didn't go over that you think would be valuable for our listeners to hear?
A couple of points, and I think Ari and I have said this in other podcasts. Remember, if something isn't written down, it never happened. Right? Everything's got to be documented.
Yeah.
Right? So you should be, and everybody in New York State knows that our employees are entitled to a 30-minute uninterrupted meal period. And you may say, well, I let my employees take their meal period. But you know what? If they're not writing down, if they're not punching in or punching out or using that hand scanner or whatever it is, and you have no records, at some point, you may, unfortunately, be subject to a random audit or possibly a complaint.
Yes.
And when the Department of Labor comes in, they're going to look at everything. And they're going to ask for the records that show your meal periods, for example. And you don't have anything written down. And you say, well, but this is how we do it. Right? And doesn't matter, it's not written down. So you really should, so any of these labor laws that, that we need to comply with, make sure that you've got documentation to support it. Because, as I said, if it's not written down, it didn't happen. And just as the U.S. Department of Labor will interview employees, so does the New York State Department of Labor.
Yes.
We can't be present, you can't be present.
Yes.
And so they're going to sit down and they're anonymous, and who knows what's going to be said. And that's why you need that documentation. So that would be my biggest, takeaway.
Yeah, very important. And I'm glad you brought that up, Rosemary. And thank you so much for joining us. I think this has been great. And this is actually perfect because to our listeners, next week, Ben Wilkinson is back and he's going to tell us it's for a bonus episode. And Ben is going to go over the top 5 ways you can prepare for an audit. And I think, Rosemary, what you just said is definitely on that list. So with that, I really appreciate it. Thanks again so much for joining us, Ro. You're great as always.
Well, thanks for having me, Ari. I hope you'll have me back.
Oh, you'll be back. Absolutely. And to our listeners, thanks so much. We'll see you next week. The Labor Employment Podcast is available on barclaydamon.com, YouTube, LinkedIn, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Google Podcasts. Like, follow, share, and continue to listen. Thanks. This material is for informational purposes only and does not constitute legal advice or a legal opinion, and no attorney-client relationship has been established or implied. Thanks for listening.